All right. Thumbs up if you can see the presentation. Anyone give me a thumbs up? All right. My name is Janine Beck, and I am the Achievement Specialist for School Culture. We have a grant through our county this year that involves continuing to train more people in our county, but also to involve community members in our training. And so I'm excited to see some community members who are responsible for mentoring a lot of the youth in our county. I am recently appointed to the board and with the Boys and Girls Club, and so I'm excited about working with them. I remember inviting them into Ballinger Creek Middle School, and I understand the program is continuing to grow. I know that they were one of the organizations to really step up when schools closed to still continue to provide assistance to our youth, and so I'm excited to be learning and growing with them and continuing to support our youth. Being out of the school, it brings you away from students. And so one of the things that I have done is to create Janine Cares, which is a way to allow adults to continue to mentor our youth. I just really feel for our youth who are at home, and the social emotional things really were on my heart. And so I am wanting to continue to mentor youth and also to build community within our community. And so I'm offering this restorative training for two purposes. One, as a part of our grant initiatives through the county, and also as a part of something that I love to do, to be an advocate for our community. So thank you for joining me this evening, and I hope you will share their presentation and participate actively. So our outcomes are to reflect on the importance of using a restorative approach specifically to manage behavior. We're going to look at this social discipline window, which you will find useful in all aspects of your life, personal and professional. And then we're going to look at the continuum, and we're going to try to build community amongst the guests that are here today. We will have people joining throughout, and I hope I can catch them, as when I'm presenting, it is difficult to see people who may be waiting. So I might have to volunteer an extra facilitator if I can figure out how to do that. If you see the invite to be a facilitator, you're going to know why. Because there might be people in the waiting room and I want them to be able to be admitted, but I'll have enough time to pause in between. So our norms: cameras are optional, but remember we're recording. Please use the mute unless you're speaking. I invite you to participate, but I do understand that you may have to multitask. And if you have questions while I'm speaking, you can always use the chat and I will get to them as soon as I can. So first opportunity to participate in a circle virtually. Use one word to describe how you are feeling today. So I get to pause for a moment. In the chat, I would like for you to use one word to describe how you are feeling today. All right, so I see messages: exhausted, defeated, hopeful, overwhelmed. I understand. I would say that I am grateful and thankful for having people here this evening to learn about restorative practices. Thank you so much. All right, the next question is to tell me, and I'm going to ask for volunteers to unmute, at least 2 people. What has been the hardest thing about quarantine? So the first circle prompt was an ability to quickly get around to assess how everyone is feeling prior to starting, gives the facilitator or the teacher or the speaker an opportunity to see how the room is feeling. This next question gives us an opportunity to really build community amongst ourselves. And so if anyone would be a brave volunteer to unmute and share what has been the hardest thing about quarantine. If you don't want to share aloud, please write it in the chat. And if I can get a volunteer or 2 volunteers, I would love to hear your responses.
This is Lois. I'll go ahead. Whoops. I didn't see your hand, Karen. I was just going to say not being with family. My family doesn't live with me, so not being with them.
Absolutely. I can relate to that. My family is in Philadelphia, so I definitely understand. Thank you for sharing. Someone else.
Dealing with people who may be germaphobes but don't take their own health too seriously, it's very frustrating.
Hey, yeah, thank you. Definitely know people at both extremes, the ones who are masked down and double masked, and then I know some who just don't wear a mask at all. I just don't understand it. So thank you for sharing. I can relate to both of those thoughts. One more person. I said two, but let's go for three. Three times the charm.
Working.
Working, yes. There's so much that can go into that answer. So if that's all you want to give, that's great, but I can go a long way with that one. I'm thankful.
Working with the kids and then working under the constraints of my job that I have to deal with criminal backgrounds. So that is a challenge for me to work with those things.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you so much. All right, moving on. We are going to look at why a restorative approach is important and what it is. When I think about a restorative approach, I'm really thinking about climate. And climate can be that of a school climate. Climate can be as a work organization, but I'm sure all you can agree that you can definitely feel a positive climate. You can feel a strained climate. And so in our schools, the most important thing for our students is to have a climate that's positive. And a restorative approach combines both that relationship-focused mindset, which we hope all teachers and all staff members or anybody that's working in the school has, with the distinctive tools that create a climate that is culturally, inherently just, racially equitable, and therefore conducive to learning for all students, no matter what's going on, where they come from, their social background, anything, economic background. And so that is the goal for why we do restorative practices. Specifically, a lot of our restorative practices work is tied to our local action plans. We're looking at increasing student and staff perceptions with respect to social emotional development. We're looking at lowering the disproportionate suspension rates in our county. We're looking at, really helping staff to build relationships so that we can have that positive climate in our schools and increase student learning and achievement through relationships, through positive climates, through students wanting to be in school and to be in school on time, and to ensure that all of our students have someone that they can trust in times of need or conflict. And so when I think of restorative practices, two R words come to mind. The first being relationships, but the second one being reflection. And in every training that I've had, either been a part of or facilitated, we always start with reflection. And so when we think about restorative practices in the aspect of repairing harm or restoring relationships, we're holding everyone accountable, everyone that was impacted. And so to do that, you have to be able to reflect. You have to be able to be honest. And so here are three quotes that I just related to community building. I want you to read each of the quotes, and in the chat, I would like for you to tell me which one resonates most with you. So the greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. Curtis Scott King. That'll be number one. Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. That'll be number two. Helen Keller. There is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Margaret Wheatley. So in the chat, just let me know which one resonates most with you. And then we'll take a look at why. Would anyone like to share? Unmute and share which one resonates most with you and why. I'll use my teacher wait time. Thank you. I saw 2 people unmute. Carolyn, are you willing to share which one resonates most with you?
The Helen Keller one resonates a lot with me.
Okay, did you want to share why?
Because in this climate right now, especially now, we're so divided. And being that we're so divided, it has become a challenge for people to work together. But I think that this is the best time for people to work together, because for us to like take away all those distractions, all the destruction that's going around, togetherness is so important.
I agree. And that's been my tagline, one community together strong. Someone else? Thank you for sharing.
I would say for me, the Coretta Scott King quote was more reflective upon something that resonates with me. I think it calls into the equation, the compassion word, really. The greatest of a community is most accurately, like I would rather be accurate in the level of impact that we're making. But when you bring in the measure of compassionate actions of its members, to have compassion, you're thinking outside of yourself. So it's not a selfish type of maneuver. I'm not just working with people, but I'm also mindful of how it's going to impact other people in my community, whether they've been through suffering, whatever they've experienced. So that really resonated with me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, when I think of restorative practices, when we're holding people accountable for something that may have hurt us, that's important work, right? It's going to take some soul searching, some forgiveness, some empathy, some of the ability to put yourself in another's shoes. And that's asking a lot for our students. It's asking a lot for our staff members. And I applaud all of the schools who have sent so many staff members already to be trained in restorative practices. And I applaud our county and our superintendent for appointing me to the position to be able to be in a place that we are, using resources from the International Institute of Restorative Practices. Those are where the 2 books come from. And that was where I received my training to be able to pour out into our county. And so I'm pleased to have community members here again tonight to kind of understand what we're doing in our county. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. All right, and so if you were to lead your own training and you were to, let's say, do a parent group, you may want to find 3 quotes that relate to parents or your philosophy on what parents that resonate most with you. And always start your training off with some type of reflection to kind of hook and to kind of get that why going. All right, so why? What are the principles of a restorative approach? Well, relationships, equity, all voices. When I ask you to write in the chat, everyone gets to respond. We want to do that in our classroom. A lot of times we have to use calling sticks. One fortunate thing about the virtual learning is that the chat is an easy way to engage all learners. We want to think about inclusive decision making. I will applaud our board for the outer districting. It was phenomenal to see how much engagement, how much expectation clarity occurred as the outer districting process for the LOU occurred. And I use that in every training that I've done. You have to be able to engage and to explain and to have expectation clarity when you're making decisions, especially when they impact so many. And so there were town halls everywhere. There were maps everywhere. Those are the kinds of things that we have to think about when we're in positions of power and authority. We have to think about how we can be inclusive in our decision making. And so one aspect of restorative practices training speaks a lot to something called the FAIR process. And I won't go into too much detail, but the ease, the engagement, the expectation, and the expectation clarity is important. Shared ownership. On the first day of school, for all the parents in the room, you're able to kind of get a look at what happens on the first day of school. And hopefully you saw some classroom norms and values being explained, and having the students kind of weigh in on what rules and expectations will occur. We do that also in our schools with our admin teams and our leadership teams. We have a school improvement planning team, which we invite parents to be a part of, and that really helps the community, all stakeholders, to feel involved. And then restorative practices also requires us to consider non-punitive responses. Notice I use the word consider, because we're not replacing every single punitive consequence. There are some discretionary offenses, and then there are some non-discretionary offenses that we have in every school or in the walk of life, right? We have law enforcement for a reason. And so as we consider restorative practices as an alternative to suspension, we want to emphasize that non-punitive responses are the ones that are more beneficial than the punitive responses. And so whenever possible that we can replace or supplement a restorative intervention approach or consequence, that is what we expect to see in our schools. Positive change is supported when people in positions of authority do things with others, and that speaks to the social discipline window, which we'll go into in a moment. So this slide is very important. If you want to learn about restorative practices, this slide is one that you want to pay particular attention to, because in a nutshell, it summarizes what we are asking from schools who are implementing restorative practices. One, we're saying we need you to be 80% proactive. You know, the majority of the time we want you doing things to build community with stakeholders, with your staff, with your students, with your parents. 80% of the time. If you're in a building where you're only doing things with your stakeholders 20% of the time, chances are the climate is not so jovial, and you want to do more community building. That way, when you have to be responsive and you have to address a major problem, whether it's a student problem, a staff problem, a community problem, it's easier because you've already laid that groundwork and allowed for those community relationships to be in place. And so in front of you, you have the restorative practices continuum. From left to right, it's, less work versus more work, right? And so as the achievement specialist for school culture, I do it all. On the right side of the continuum, it's going to take me more time, more people, more planning to have that formal conference. I'll give you an example of, let's say, a racially charged incident occurs and I need to talk to everyone involved, and they may be differencing. I heard that mentioned earlier as a comment, right? I would spend time talking separately with different groups of people, understanding from different parents and students and stakeholders what everyone's perspective is before bringing everyone together if possible. Now, restorative practices in this mindset is voluntary, right? I'm not going to bring someone together who's so racially charged that they're going to still offend the people that they already offended, right? And so it takes a lot of time, planning, training, and skills to really facilitate a formal conference. Versus our informal approaches to restorative practices. We want to see this all across our school. And so easy things to implement would be language, right? How you speak to a person. I am so proud to hear. I am excited to hear. I am appreciative. I am grateful. I am thankful. I'm delighted. Using that effective language like that allows a person to get feedback, to have some empathy, and for you to set boundaries still. And restorative practices is definitely high control, high support, but it's all about communication. And so there's a training specifically catered towards effective statements and effective questions that really look at how to communicate so that you are not offending and that you are being very clear on what your communication process is. And so effective statements are also accompanied by effective questions. And so last school year, we ordered the question cards and the posters for all of our schools to be able to use, those who are choosing to get to have restorative practices, it provides a level of consistency and fidelity with implementation, very similar to what PBIS is doing. And whether a school is implementing PBIS, restorative practices, there has to be some kind of school-wide management process. And so restorative practices combined with PBIS or restorative practices alone is just one way to make sure that you have consistency when you're managing expectations. Now, I know we have a teacher in the room. And so, Natalie, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Do you want to talk about restorative practices? I know it's going on a little bit in your school, and whether you've seen any of the effective statements, questions. Small impromptu conferences would be a teacher or an administrator pulling a student to the side privately and having a discussion restoratively using questions except for why questions, like what happened? What were you thinking when that occurred? What do you need to do to make things right? Those kind of things, or even a circle. So Natalie, if you will.
Yeah. So last year was my first year teaching, and then the school closed. So I actually don't have too many examples that I can pull from. I teach at TJ High, but I know that it was something that was being discussed. The school I worked with previously for 5 years, that was sort of incorporated, like in terms, for example, if a student was disruptive in class to the point where the teacher had to send the student out, we were required, but it wasn't like, you're required, that's bad. It was like required, this is good. To have a resolution conference with students. So at TJ High, like I said, it's just because my first year of teaching, the year of the pandemic, I haven't really seen much, but I have heard that they are, in terms of community circles, and I know that with virtual learning, that's been something that has been talked about and incorporated in classrooms in terms of like social emotional learning. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, no, thank you for sharing. And I will say that initially the restorative practices work group in our county, former principal, the late Jet Reed, is the one who started our restorative practices work group in our county in 2017. So the groundwork includes a lot of different administrators from across the county coming together monthly. We're going to be starting up again in November for this year. And including a few more community members, but we met once a month for the last 3 years, just really trying to explore what restorative practices look like in other counties and how we could implement it here in our district. So thank you for sharing. Anyone else want to share, looking at the restorative practices continuum of services, the options where they may have seen any of these things implemented, or where it might have been useful to use one of these things?
Could I chime in?
Yeah, please.
So I formerly worked at like non-public schools.
Okay.
And after, I guess you could say maybe a crisis or like more critical incidents, depending on the mindset of the student, we had counselors that would oftentimes like engage in some sort of conversation between the youth that were involved and the staff. Maybe if there was like, especially when like there was a restraint, like a physical restraint involved, just to kind of help keep the trust there between the staff and the student. And then, when there were like altercations between students, having a space where they can talk about how one was wrong and the offender can respond back. So it was good stuff.
Absolutely. I appreciate hearing that. I definitely want to make sure that we think about the how and the where and the when. I'm going to pause now for a short video that kind of speaks to what Tiana just mentioned related to, our society, not just our county, but beyond that, and how restorative practices is used and why. So I'm going to go to a quick video. This is intermission if you need to take a stretch break. I'm going to pull up this video and you'll be able to hopefully see this video. It is on the first slide here. I'm going to go to 2 videos. They're really short, so fun times facilitating.
Our world is changing at a breathtaking pace. Social patterns.
Let me pause. Can you see the video? All right, awesome.
long characterized human life are changing dramatically around the globe, diminishing social bonds within families, schools, workplaces, and communities. But humans are hardwired to connect. Just as we need food, shelter, and clothing, we also need strong and meaningful relationships to thrive. With all this in mind, what is restorative practices? Restorative practices is an emerging social science that studies how to strengthen relationships between individuals and within communities. When put into practice, the effects are profound. In schools, students experience greater safety and sense of belonging, resulting in improved behavior, less bullying, and less violence. In workplaces, leaders facilitate direct communication among staff and address conflict as it arises. The result is higher performance, greater accountability, and effective collaboration. In criminal justice, new options allow victims and offenders, friends and family, to repair the emotional harm caused by crime. Throughout our neighborhoods, restorative practices give regular people more voice in the issues that matter most. In a nutshell, restorative practices is the science of relationships and community. Your individual daily interactions have a big impact on the world around you, at your job, with young people, and throughout your community. How we relate matters. This video was brought to you by the International Institute for Restorative Practices.
All right. I would love to hear some reaction. That was a quick 2-minute video, but I think it said a lot. And I would definitely like to hear your thoughts on so far what we've covered in relation to restorative practices. But anyone want to share a takeaway? Maybe you weren't so clear on what restorative practices is, and now you have a little bit more of an insight on what it is and how it can be used. That video specifically pointed out beyond the schoolhouse where restorative practices is also being used. Anyone want to share? Yes.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, I had to find the mute button. Yeah, I think the thing that sort of resonated with me, and also I couldn't quite put it into words when we were reflecting on the quote, is just the importance of people feeling valued and a sense of belonging. And I think that that's sort of thing that I'm taking away from this, is that this is sort of allows for, it's an opportunity or vehicle for helping both students and staff as well to feel that they're valued and that they belong in that space. So that's what I'm taking away from this.
Absolutely. And for any administrator, that is a valuable thing. We want to make sure that everyone feels like they belong in our community.
All right, get to the unmute as well. I'm getting the sense of getting away from judgment. It's very easy to jump in with a judgment, and this gets you to maybe walk in someone else's shoes. And if I can ask a question here as well, do you find that a lot of the why comes out as you're asking what? You say, what happened? And they start telling you why they did that. And so without asking it, it kind of comes out.
Absolutely.
People need to get that out, but you get to the core mission of what was it you did. Okay, thank you. Yeah, the lack of judgment.
Great question. Great question. It does remove that, oh, you already think I'm guilty when you say, why did you do that? Versus
What happened? Right. I wanted to add oh, go ahead, Carolyn, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're fine. I'll go after you.
Okay. I just wanted to add that I'm teaching some education classes now at Shepherd. And one of the things that I'm putting at the focus of my classes is relationships. Because yes, Natalie, you said about that community and that feeling like they belong, and what can we do to make our students feel like they belong in our classrooms and that they are welcome and that we want them to be there. And I keep saying this quote, and I cannot remember where I heard it, but the quote is, we need to put relationships before everything. We need to look at context before content, and we need to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs before we look at Bloom's taxonomy when we're in education. And I think that, when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is all there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I definitely, Lincoln Elementary Principal Eric Rhodes is always preaching care over content. Terrellyn?
I have to agree with what Natalie said about community and Karen said about not judging, and what Lois said about relationships. I know in my field that the judgment has to stop at the door because of the population I deal with. And then just recently, yesterday, when I was dealing with a young man, and he admitted that I was the first person that actually cared about him, right? So he had a very large criminal background, and when you step in the door, that judgment has to go out the door, and you build a relationship off of that. They're not going to get it right the first time, they're not going to get it right the second time, but you just have to keep building that relationship. And I think that can also go into the education system. A lot of kids do not come from some kids do not come from a strong family background, and you don't know what they came from when they step into your classroom. So not judging and building a relationship with that student just outside of the books is so important, and not judging them of what they say and what they do, because when you are more what we call trauma informed in our field, it does help a lot when connecting with people. You're muted.
Thank you so much for that. It's getting everybody on this top row, the mute button. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. I really appreciate it. I'm going to attempt to share my screen again and get back to the presentation. I want to finish part one before 6:50 or 4:50, and so then we'll go into part two to be about circles and the application of restorative practices. And so you're welcome to continue to stay with me. So let me share. You're going to see yourselves for a second, maybe. I don't know. But I'm going to go back to the presentation. There we are. Back to present mode. All right. So as we continue to think about the implementation of restorative practices and review kind of what we've already seen so far this evening, I would like to ask you to take an inventory. So how restorative are you? We are attempting to think that we are always restorative, and that is definitely not the case. I will tell you that I am not, as a principal even, I was not always restorative. There are going to be times where you are going to, not be so restorative. For example, the fire drill went off and I didn't plan a fire drill. A student had pulled the fire drill. So then I'm in a different mindset than the restorative support everyone. I'm following expectations. We have rules, we have safety protocols, you know how to follow them, high control, less support during a incident that was unplanned, right? And so there's 4 boxes in what we call the social discipline window that help us to kind of assess where we are. There's the punitive, which is high control, low support. There's the permissive, which is high support, low control. There's the low control, low support, which is very neglectful. And then there's the restorative. We aim to be high control, high support all the time, but there are definitely external and internal factors that are going to cause you to move from different windows at different times. And so in the chat, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and I am going to place this opportunity for you to be reflective about how restorative you are. And so if you would take a moment to kind of look at the questions. You don't have to tally it up and share your results, but I will read the questions to you because we are filming, but I'm going to allow you an opportunity to look at the presentation here on your own as soon as I get this MacBook. It's so much fun to follow my directions to be able to put this in the chat for you. All right, so first, let's go ahead and just be a teacher and read. Do I remain calm during the conversation? Do I really listen without interrupting? Does the student understand why they are having this conversation? Would the student feel like I'm a good listener? Do we explore how the school values apply to the issue? Does the student understand the harm they've caused, who has been affected, and how? Do I talk about how the incident affects me? Do I take responsibility for any part I might have played when things went wrong, acknowledge it, and even apologize? Do I consider the extent to which I have a relationship with this student and how that affects my expectations for our interaction? If the student apologizes to me, do I accept the apology respectfully? Do I collaborate with the student to formulate a plan? Have I at any stage asked someone I trust to observe my practice and give me honest feedback? Do I try to handle most issues or incidents myself? Do I seek support when issues get tricky for me? Do I follow the school systems when looking for more support? Is the relationship with the student repaired? And so that really is the assessment. I was having trouble copying it, but I'm going to share it in a second. Does anything resonate with you about that inventory on how restorative am I? That's something that we would share with school staff, mainly teachers or counselors who are a part of a staff where they're, managing a behavior situation. Does anything resonate with you about that reflection? Lots of good questions there. Tiana.
I can't give it to a specific question, but my role now as the assistant coach at Frederick with Frederick girls basketball program, one of the things we've been thinking about is with the issues that kids are experiencing, how is it that because as coaches, we're not always easy on them. And so it can be easy for some sort of resentment to build up without you being aware. And that can change how a student is responding or interacting with you as well as their teammates. And so how is it that we will kind of mediate all of these things on top of the pressure of the pandemic? And I just see this being one of those things. After the assessment, I can say I can work on my restorativeness. I can.
Thank you.
I can grow in that area.
Yeah, I think, personal connections are probably the most difficult for me. Professionally, I'm very restorative, but sometimes at home, I have a harder time being so restorative. Like, they love me, they're gonna be all right. So, yeah. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead. Okay.
I feel like it calls into account your own actions and behavior. So it's hard to engage with someone else to be restorative. And I think it goes back to who mentioned the judgment. So I've already done the work on myself, or I'm doing it simultaneously while helping this other person. So I'm still learning something. I'm still being restorative or in the act of restoring my own practices while helping someone else engage in restorative practices. I feel like it's a dual function.
Absolutely, definitely. And in our county, we talk a lot about cultural proficiency, and we look at those implicit bias and things that we have to recognize what we're bringing as well. And that was one of the questions as I was rereading that. I hadn't seen it in a while. That question related to reflecting and having someone else, even an outside observer, reflect on your practice and what you're bringing as well. Anyone else? Definitely some good points. All right, I am going to go ahead and share the screen again, and we're going to conclude just about this presentation for part one. Again, remember that we want to make sure that we are 80% proactive so that when we do have those, small instances of conflict or significant number of conflicts, that we are handling it restoratively based on one of the questions in that reflection was the relationships that we have established. It asked the person, do you have a relationship to even address this situation? Because sometimes, I would tag out with an assistant principal who I knew had a better relationship than me with a student when we had to process a situation. And so we have to be mindful of all of that when we are handling situations, especially given trauma and not knowing what kind of baggage someone is carrying, whether it be yourself and how you're feeling when you come into a building or into a space with a conversation. There's a thing called the moral compass that, really, and another training I've done with equity work, you want to look at how you are owning where you are before you even engage in a contentious conversation, right? And so am I coming from a moral space, or am I coming from an intellectual space? And how are those two spaces combined when we're talking about something that we're both very passionate about, or that one of us is passionate and the other one isn't? And so a lot of times when we have those formal conferences, it's important to add that layer of ownership to where we are before we engage in a dialogue. So thank you so much for your comments. Can you see the screen right now? I think I can just go ahead and present, right? Everyone see the slide right now, correct? I will definitely share this presentation. So moving on, thumbs up if you can see the presentation. Yes, yeah, great. Why restorative practices? We want to catch them doing good more often than we're redirected them. Think about your favorite teacher, your favorite coach, your favorite mentor, the person you respect most in life. Chances are they're restorative. They're high in control. I mean, you know that they're in control, but you also feel their level of support when it comes up to issues where maybe you've done something wrong. And so children most likely to be referred or suspended are the students who most need us. They need our help, they need our supervision, they need our counseling, our guidance, and sometimes even more of a professional help. And so being restorative, it causes us to be empathetic, as someone mentioned earlier, and to be aware and to use that trauma-informed lens to ensure that we're looking at the big picture and not taking anything personal. We're able to then separate the deed from the doer. And so, Carolyn, I know that's something that you have to do in your profession. You just spoke to it a little bit earlier, but we want to train our teachers and our counselors and our staff members and anyone who works in our school with children or comes into contact with children to be able to separate the act and the deed from the doer, and to still, include them as valuable contributing members of our society. And so that's why restorative practice is for us. Can anyone share any other reasons why they feel, especially now, that restorative practices is important? So in the chat, if you want to share a couple of reasons why you think restorative practices is important for our schools, why is restorative practices important for our community? I'm going to pull up the chat and try to share out what I'm seeing. Uh-oh. Okay. Can someone unmute and read some of the responses in the chat, because it's giving me this little block right now for some reason, probably because I'm presenting. Tiana, you want to read some of the responses you see in the chat? Why restorative practices was the question.
All right. It provides a safe space for people to heal and grow. That's Carolyn. We have de-escalation in situations, allowing people to come together, from Karen, and from Lois. Point taken. I think it's a new way of looking at what is important in the classroom. It's less stressful and helps everyone learn and grow. Natalie is saying, I think RP is crucial in our schools today. As someone has previously mentioned, we are in a very divided world. This is particularly true in our diverse community.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Exclusionary punishment may work in the short term, right? As a classroom teacher, as a former science teacher, if I excluded a child from my classroom, it removed the student for a moment, and it provided me a little bit of relief and some time for myself to cool down, right? As a teacher. Same thing for an administrator who may need to suspend a student. It provides that classroom teacher, the people who maybe saw the altercation if it were a fight, a little time to cool off. But does it really change behavior? And that is the question. Does it change behavior? What it does is, model undesirable problem solving. We're saying when you have a conflict with someone, kick them out, right? That doesn't teach you how to manage the conflict. It reduces motivation and the ability for us to teach our children or to work with our staff members to maintain self-control. It generates student anger and disengagement. Tiana, you mentioned it earlier about how if you're not so restorative, how there can be some resentment, for that high control type of personality that comes a lot of times with coaching, right? It results in problems like truancy. Well, I don't want to come to school because nobody in that building is restorative. That's not the language they would use, but that's basically what they're saying when they say nobody cares. It leads to dropout, vandalism. You suspend a child and then, graffiti appears on your building, right? Aggression when they return to the building. It's an increased likelihood that dropout will occur, and we're pushing them into a subculture where criminal activity becomes, their home, their family. And that's not what we want for any of our community members, especially our youth, right? And so that's why restorative practices. We want to teach problem solving. We want to teach conflict resolution. We want to model that for our youth. And so in the county, we connected most to our framework for teaching, and every teacher, every staff member is evaluated in the county. And so the classroom environment is a priority. And so when I think restorative practices, I think domain 2. The framework for teaching supports professional growth, right? And we want to focus on increasing student achievement. Well, in order to do that, we have to make sure that the students want to be in our class, that we have relationships, that they're actively engaged, that we're planned and prepared for instruction, but also allowing everyone to participate. And restorative practices gives you that equitable process to allow everyone to consistently implement a system that's going to prevent or lessen or decrease incidents of referrals or infractions, and to build community, right? And so we also have talked a lot in our county about cultural proficiency and equity. And so the links here are some of the work that we've done with assumptions checklists and focusing on assets and overcoming barriers. And so I won't share those right now, but once you get the presentation, you'll be able to look at those. But we're looking at equity and valuing diversity, and we talked a little bit about how we have to be able to step in someone else's shoes earlier. So that's all restorative practices. And I want you to know that it's nothing new. It's kind of what we already should be doing with good teaching. But the restorative practices continuum that we saw with the informal and formal practices allows you to have a common language when communicating our what and our why to community members like parents, and our staff, and even our students. And so one of my goals, in addition to community, is to also train some leaders through the student. So having student leaders be empowered to be restorative leaders as well. I will applaud again our county for K-2 implementation of PAFS program in all of our schools, but that is very restorative. Some of our principals have decided to use their budget to go beyond second grade, and they are using PAFS and the social emotional curriculum in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade as well. And so I can tell you from my own children who were K-3, K-2nd and 3rd grade, watching the change in their language and holding themselves accountable when they were problem solving, to stop and think. It was just amazing to see 1st graders reuse the language of how they're feeling and how to work through what do you need to do to make things right. I'll shout out Yellow Springs Elementary School for using systems and processes to really be restorative along with the PAFS program. So the impact, finally, of a restorative approach, obviously increased connections of all stakeholders in the community, an improved sense of belonging. Again, we hear that trauma responsive support. Who wouldn't want everyone to say, not what's wrong with that child, but what happened and how can we fix it? And then we want, physically safe environments, but, we really also need, and someone mentioned it early, caring, emotionally safe schools. And so that's the impact of a restorative environment. So in future trainings, the social discipline window is one of the most important. Effective statements and questions, we kind of mentioned that earlier when we looked at the restorative continuum. Circles, we've done a little bit today, and I've also mentioned the FAIR process. Of all of those, I really wanted to highlight what the social discipline window is all about. If you take a look at the Twitter page that I created when I was principal at Ballinger, it really does show you ways to build relationships. You always want to consider, what does a healthy relationship even look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? So in the chat right now, I'd like for you to pick one of those: looks like, sounds like, or feel like. Think about that person you described as your favorite person, the one that you respected the most. What does a healthy relationship look like, feel like, or sound like? How do you know it's a healthy relationship? Type that in the chat for me. All right, respecting boundaries, trust. Awesome. Boundaries, communication, trust. Very nice. Accountability. Definitely. When we think about our favorite coaches, our favorite mentors, the person that we respect most, they're probably restorative in nature. And thinking about that, I wanted to quickly go by and look at the social discipline window, because to me, that's the end all be all of what restorative practice is. So before you leave this training tonight, I definitely want you to have an understanding of the social discipline window. And here's how we can quickly do that. If you think about a word, it's going on its own, that describes a person who is high control and low in support. Somebody unmute. What word would you use to describe a person who's high control and low on support?
Control freak.
Abusive.
Manipulative.
Okay. All right.
Manipulative.
Okay, nice. Yeah, that's what we use when we think about the punitive style. That is what it is. That's the word that we use in our one box of our social discipline window. How about a word that you would use to describe a person who was high on support but low on control?
Unorganized.
Okay. Anyone else? High support, low control.
Uncommitted.
Okay.
Or lacks commitment.
Lack of boundaries.
Okay. We call that permissive in the social discipline window. What word would you use for someone who's low on control and low on support?
Uninvolved.
Yep. And we use the word neglectful. And then our ideal situation, which I told you earlier that we can't always live in that high control, high support, but that's the restorative box. And here's our social discipline window. And I wanted to make sure that you left understanding what the social discipline window is and how it connects. There's so many activities that we can do related to the social discipline window. But as you see the axis on the left, or up and down, high control defined as limit setting and accountability was one of the words I heard earlier, and combined with the support and engagement or encouragement and guidance, right? The philosophy is basically human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive and more likely to make positive changes when people in positions of authority and in any given setting. Authority member could be a cafeteria employee, it could be a bus driver, it could be the principal, a teacher, a counselor, anyone to a child would be a position of authority. And so we want to do things with people. And so restorative practices helps us to be able to do that. The other boxes, as was explained earlier, and you use other words to describe them, but this is how the International Institute of Restorative Practices defines the social discipline window. And as you think about it, let's do a quick activity. If you were on your job and you had a deadline and you were feeling a lot of pressure, which box might you operate in? Would you be very restorative, or might you be more punitive in nature? Be honest. Put it in the chat. I won't call you out. Put it in the chat.
Oh.
Go ahead. What did you say, Tiana?
I was going to say, I know I would be punitive.
Right. And
we
so
can feel good later.
Different external and internal factors cause us to move from different aspects of this box. And I will say, it's okay. But the true restorative practitioner is the one who can say, well, I wasn't so restorative, and this is why, right? Or I was punitive because, Or I'm permissive because they're asking me to train a brand new assistant principal. There's 25 referrals. I'm just going to do everything for her, right? So there's different reasons why you may be permissive or even neglectful. Neglectful, well, it's the last day of school and I'm retiring. So I might not have a well-designed lesson plan for you today. So there are different reasons externally and internally that people might move in different boxes. How about where do you go where you're feeling overwhelmed, uncertain, or scared in a situation? Which box might you operate in? Anyone?
Neglectful.
Yeah, if you're like, you just totally shut down, right? I'm not sure which one you're relating to, overwhelmed, uncertain, or scared, but a lot of times we shut down completely. When
All of them.
All of them. Feeling it, yeah, right, exactly. Where do you go when you're feeling sympathy for someone else?
Restorative.
Nice. Depends on the situation. At work, I would probably be more permissive and try to do things for the person. And at home, I probably would be more restorative as well. So yeah, definitely different external and internal factors cause you to go from different boxes. But this right here is the most important aspect to me about teaching restorative practices. You can do an activity where you read different kind of scenarios and external and internal factors and see where your staff or your team or your board, falls when they're looking at the specific questions. It's kind of a team building activity as well. So let's try something here. How much have you learned? If I were to say, sit down and shut up, or if you heard a classroom teacher or coach say, sit down and shut up, which box in the social discipline window would they be operating out of?
Punitive.
Punitive, for sure. If you say, you only have to do it if you want to, which box are you in?
Permissive.
Yes, that's correct. We're two for two. So okay, I'm an Eagles fan. It's a hard season for the Eagles fans, but anyway, all right. You are aware of the expectations in this class. How can I support you in reaching them? Which box would that be? You're aware of the expectations. How can I support you in reaching them?
Restorative.
Very restorative. High control, because I know you know how to do this. But how can I help you since it looks like you're not able to do them right now, right? And then finally, I don't care what you do, figure it out yourself.
Neglectful.
Neglect. And that's something that we hope not to ever hear from any of our teachers, but there are some times that, maybe it's that student who you've had 25 referrals on in 1 year and it didn't seem no hope. And that may end up being your response. But, different external and internal factors could cause you to have different responses. And so thinking about those 4 boxes, we call those practitioner styles. They can be in your house as well. Just want to say professionally and personally, you might see those in your housemates and people that you're living with as well. It's just good to be able to understand them. And so I want to check in right now. That is really the end of the presentation, part 1 about restorative practices. If people choose to stay on after, then I was going to go into the second hour looking at a little bit of how to implement circles in a school setting. But I would love to hear some feedback about part 1. And I will share this presentation. There are some articles here and resources. I definitely want you to visit the iirp.edu site. Plenty of webinars that are free of charge, listening circles, resources that you can use. We have ordered a ton of the books for a lot of the schools that we are training in restorative practices. I've trained Dr. Alavito's team, her cabinet, with restorative practices on day 1. We did a really crash course of the restorative practices training, and they really enjoyed it. Because of quarantine and going on quarantine, we weren't able to get to day 2, but they've been trained and they will probably get part 2 this year. And so I'm offering this training, more videos there at the end of this presentation. Again, I'm Janine Beck Achievement Specialist for School Culture. My contact information is there if you would like to have more information about restorative practices. My direct supervisor is Mr. Dana Falls. And so, part 2 is community training, but I'm going to stop right here. I am going to also stop my sharing, and I am going to stop the presentation recording. I want to thank you all for this evening. If you want to log back on, we will go into part 2, but I know that some people had to leave at the 5 o'clock hour, and so I am going to invite you to stay on, take maybe a 5 or so minute break, and you can join back in, and we'll do probably a 30-minute session looking at restorative practices, circles in the implementation of restorative practices. So I'm going to stop the recording right now for a intermission.